Okay, so I've got Dr. Steve Watts here with me today. That's probably a name that'll be known to many of you. He's spoken out publicly on the Lucy Letby case recently. I'm going to read a biography of Dr. Watts first, and then we will go through all of the questions I got for him, which are many in number. So, Steve spent 31 years in UK policing and retired at the rank of Assistant Chief Constable, Specialist Operations, a career built almost entirely in detective work. Early on, he joined the detective branch and rose through every investigative rank from detective constable through sergeant, inspector, chief inspector, superintendent, chief superintendent, and then ACC, which is assistant chief constable. He led major local and national inquiries and was the national lead for investigative interviewing and for healthcare related death investigations. At a national level, he served as vice chair of the Homicide Working Group, helping write and shape core investigative doctrine used across England and Wales, including material on investigative mindset, hypothesis development, and the risks of cognitive bias. While a superintendent, he studied for a master's in investigative psychology and after retirement completed a doctorate in criminal justice. He has also published on healthcare-related deaths and major incident investigation. His operational experience is wide. He led multi-agency inquiries, including a complex investigation at Gosport War Memorial Hospital, worked on large-scale national reviews, ran the UK War Crimes Investigative Team in Kosovo, and has been an international policing advisor and academic lecturer in Australia and elsewhere. Since retiring to Sydney, he has continued consultancy and lecturing across policing and criminal justice. He is an outspoken critic of investigation by celebrity and the growing kudos culture in high-profile homicide work. Drawing on his policing, academic, and national policing policy background, he has publicly challenged the conduct and expert structure of Operation Hummingbird, arguing for rigorous multidisciplinary review, transparent decision logs, and safeguards against confirmation bias. So, with that being said, hello to Steve. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for inviting me on. That's pretty comprehensive. I'm not sure I've got much else to add to that. Pretty extensive background in policing and particularly criminal investigations. I mean, that's been my life, if you like.
Can you tell?
And I have been and remain very passionate about standards in criminal investigation and the enormous responsibility and privilege that officers have, that investigators have, particularly investigating the most serious offences, and those clearly are those of homicide, violence, and offences involving children. So it's very important to me that things are done properly. I tried to make sure that was the case whilst I was serving. And as you've indicated, I've spoken out on a number of issues in that field.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about Kosovo, perhaps? Because that seems quite a standout to me.
That was a very significant period in my life. That was in 2000. It it just occurs to me a lot that sometimes when I mention to people Kosovo, actually they look at you because they don't realise what you're talking about. Because of course, to me it happened yesterday, but actually it happened about 25 years ago. So in 1999. There were incidents in the Balkans, Eastern Europe, where the Serbian regime at that time began to move into other areas within the Balkans and became involved in acts of genocide against the local population, the local Muslim population, the Albanian Muslim population, particularly in Kosovo. I was asked after those hostilities had ceased, after NATO had taken action, to lead the British war crimes team investigating war crimes there in the year 2000. So I led a multidisciplinary team of police officers from across the United Kingdom, pathologists, radiographers, and anthropologists. And our remit was working with the International Criminal Tribunal from The Hague, was to identify the location of deceased persons from the conflict, to exhume the bodies, to conduct forensic examinations of the bodies, in order to identify cause of death and also to identify the individuals themselves, if we could, in order to return the remains to families for burial. So yeah, a really challenging time, and clearly for me, completely outside of the normal day-to-day work that I was engaged in the UK in terms of investigations, but a really important time in terms of understanding that area of the world, understanding the issues in relation to multinational conflict, and I think a real wake-up call in terms of what can happen when societies break down and when societies move in the wrong direction. So yeah, so an important time for me, and one which I look back on with some degree of pride in terms of the work that the team that I led did, the important work they did during that year.
Absolutely. So you've obviously become interested in Lucy's case. So when was the first time that you've begun to be concerned or question elements of it, and what was the catalyzing event for this?
Well, you mentioned that during my career, I was the vice chair of the homicide working group for the Association of Chief Police Officers. So that was a national group across the UK looking at raising standards and procedures in relation to the investigation of all homicides and major crime. A really important group of senior detectives coming together on a regular basis to try to drive up standards. One of the tasks that I had as part of that group was as the lead for deaths in healthcare settings. So it was all settings, including hospitals, care homes, anywhere where people were receiving healthcare support. So as part of that, I conducted a range of research within the NHS, private care, and across UK policing, and myself and others drew up the national guidance for the investigation of deaths in healthcare settings, which to a great extent remains today within the Murder Investigation Manual, which is distributed by the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing, and is, if you like, the gold standard for investigating cases of this type. So with that interest in mind, I was aware of the case as it progressed, and I would read articles in newspapers relating to it. But then I came across the podcast by Caroline Cheetham and Liz Hull, and I started listening to that. I found it really interesting. But then as time went on, I started to wonder when some evidence would arrive, some cogent evidence, accepting that that it was being prosecuted on the basis that it was a heavily circumstantial case. I was still expecting to see some cogent evidence at some stage, and to my mind, it never arrived. And I was shocked when Lucy was found guilty. I was shocked at times during the accounts of the case as it moved on, with some of the interpretations that were being placed upon what to me seemed to be relatively anodyne pieces of circumstantial evidence. Things around her behaviour, the notes, the way in which she would clean the babies and deal with the families. I was really troubled with the way in which the prosecution moved forward, and literally was astonished when she was convicted as to how a jury could arrive at that view. And that's not a criticism of the jury at all. I think we might get into a conversation later about how we do moving forward. How we, as a society, investigate and prosecute these cases. Are we getting to the stage where potentially, juries are not the right forum to hear matters of such difficulty and complexity? But that's perhaps an argument for later.
Yeah, absolutely. So naturally, as someone whose career has been so obviously in the police, you're naturally going to be looking at the police investigation when you see that there's, as we agreed, very little evidence in the court case. So I know that you have many criticisms of this investigation, so perhaps you could go over some of the key points and concerns firstly.
Yeah, that's right. And I suppose that's what I bring to the table. I've got no real experience of medical science, of statistics. There are some very eminent people, some very significant people who are coming forward to provide support in relation to that. But what I do have, as you've indicated, is very significant experience of investigations, and particularly of homicide investigations, and in particular healthcare-related investigations. I have concerns about the investigation, and we'll go into those in detail shortly. What I'm not going to do, though, is to enter into ad hominem attacks in relation to particular individuals. The officers dealing with this investigation within Operation Hummingbird were dealing with very, very complex issues, very challenging. Although, as I say, there's some guidance out there. It's not step by step. This is how you do an investigation of this type. They're all different. And I think there are real issues around the way in which police forces identify and engage experts. And that's clearly an issue which has arisen in this case. So I think the investigation itself, Operation Hummingbird, from what I've seen, and I've only got access to publicly available documentation, from what I've seen, it was very well resourced. It was very well structured. It had all the roles and positions and facilities in place I would have expected for an investigation of that size. And I think the leadership team were doing their best to drive the investigation forward in the way that they thought was appropriate. And I think that the investigative team themselves were working really hard to do the right thing. I think the problem is that from an early stage, the investigation was flawed in the sense that it was going in the wrong direction because of confirmation bias, and we'll talk about that again in a moment in terms of how that manifests.
Yeah.
Some of the key issues for me are firstly the apparent acceptance without challenge of initially the accounts of Dr Daly and J Rām, and then later of Daly Evans. In the video that was produced by Operation Hummingbird, and I do wonder why that video was produced, who the audience was expected to be. But in any event, the account given in the video, where the SO said that he'd investigated all possible causes of death and injury. Well, I've looked for it and I've seen no evidence that alternative hypotheses such as infections as a result of sewage on the ward, poor care, staffing levels, etc., that they were fully eliminated as potential causes for injury and death. Then we look to the statistical chart, the apparent unflinching acceptance of what we now know to be a flawed statistical chart that purported to show that Lucy Letby was present at all deaths and injuries. And I think in relation to that, it's particularly concerning that they started to go down the path of challenging that evidence, as they rightly should, of getting somebody else in, somebody of expertise, Dr J Rām, to say, look, can you look at this? Can you tell us, whether it's it's valid, whether it does what it purports to do? And she'd given them an early indication that perhaps it didn't. And then she received an email from, I think, somebody pretty significant, pretty senior within the Hummingbird team, saying, look, we've had a conversation with the Crown Prosecution Service, and they've instructed us not to go down this path. Mm. Absolutely astonishing. The constitutional position of the Crown Prosecution Service and the police are quite simply, the police do the investigation, the Crown Prosecution Service review the evidence. They may give advice on, whether or not the police might want to look in other areas for evidence to see if they can answer questions which need to be answered in terms of the prosecution. They then decide upon whether or not to charge, and then conduct the prosecution. Specifically, they do not and cannot give instructions to the police to do or not to do anything. and I'm astonished that if this has happened, I think there's a real issue there around who was running the investigation and how it was being coordinated.
Yeah, can I just pick up on this? So I know you mentioned this or spoke about it quite a bit on John Sweeney's podcast, the Crown Prosecution Service,
Yeah.
and the division of responsibility and powers, essentially. So, how did this happen? I mean, how did it happen? Why did the Crown Prosecution Service decide, all right, we're just going to stick our nose into the investigation, and why did the police listen to them?
Well, yeah, two good questions. I mean, I don't know because you've not had access to the internal documentation, um, which would have been generated as part of the investigation. I think it's important that certainly Mark MacDonald, Lucy's barrister, gets access to that material and it's properly analysed. In this particular set of circumstances, I'm not surprised that the Crown Prosecution Service were working very closely with the investigation. It's a complex investigation. The police are gathering a lot of material, and in cases such as this, and investigations that I've run, there's often early engagement with the Crown Prosecution Service, and on occasions you might find that the Crown Prosecution Service will allocate a particular lawyer to work with the investigation and provide advice as they go along. But clearly, it's advice. Um, I've worked with a lot of Crown prosecution lawyers, good and bad, as everyone is from every organisation. I've had pretty heated conversations with Crown prosecuting lawyers over particular issues, but I've never had a circumstance where they got even close to trying to instruct me or direct me to do anything or not to do anything. And I've never had any reports from any colleagues that I work with or work for me saying that they'd had such an instruction from the Crown Prosecution Service. It just doesn't happen. It's clear in their code of practice. So it may, I would expect there perhaps to be a conversation within the investigation where the police may say, look, we're thinking of seeing this person, Dr. Hutton. She's got some reservations around the statistical chart, but we're going to take a statement from her, providing an analysis. And the Crown Prosecution Service might say, well, do we need that evidence? Is it important to the prosecution? And there might be a discussion around it. But to suggest that they would say, no, we don't want you going down that path, so we're now instructing you not to gather evidence. If that happened, and we don't know that it did, it may have been, that the email was badly worded by the police officer. If we're being, as charitable as we can. If it actually happened that they were instructed not to gather evidence, which would have put a different slant, would have put a different interpretation on a very important piece of evidence, then I think there are real concerns there, real concern.
So, I mean, I think we can safely say it would have put a different slant on it, just purely based on my interview with Jane and what she said. I don't see how any other outcome is even remotely feasible. And then also Jane said, I was fully expecting to be engaged. I'd given them my fees and I'd said what needs to be done. And then I just got an email saying, oh, we don't need you anymore. So overall, it's a very strange, it's generous to describe it as a strange episode, isn't it?
It is, if we're being charitable. I wouldn't be quite so concerned if, they'd dispensed with Jane's services and gone to somebody else, equally qualified, equally as eminent. I would understand that. But the fact that that point of view, which clearly is not just Jane's position from a statistical point of view, a number of very eminent people have said similar things. The fact that that position wasn't put to the jury, I think is a real cause of concern. As is the fact that that interchange wasn't disclosed to Lucy Letby's lawyers at the time. There is an obligation on the prosecution, the police and the prosecution, to disclose unused material that may support the defence case or undermine the prosecution case. and that's clearly a piece of information which should do exactly that. And it wasn't disclosed, so I think that there are further concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have an academic background in investigative psychology, and you earlier mentioned the confirmation bias that I think we've all seen in this investigation. So I wonder if you could discuss that firstly with regard to investigative decision making.
Yeah, I mean, before that, can I just finish up on
Yes, of course.
the area of concern?
Please.
Um, was we got sort of through those and then went off
Oh,
to talk
yes.
about.
No problem. Please go back to that. That's fine.
Yeah. Another area is the way that the medical evidence was obtained and validated. In particular, the way that Daly Evans was appointed. I think there are some issues of concern there. Um, and why Operation Hummingbird didn't follow best practice and appoint a panel of experts to review all of the material to come to individual views and then to moderate those views as a group. I think that's a really big issue. And on top of that, I'm really concerned about the way in which the pile of circumstantial evidence, I think it's the best way to describe it, has been misinterpreted and given skewed interpretations. And we're talking there about the text messages between Lucy Letby and Dr. A, the practice of dressing the babies after death, of sending notes to families, the internet searches of bereaved families, handover notes that were found in Lucy's home, the notes made by Letby interpreted as confessions, and the assessments of Lucy's demeanour and behaviour. All the interpretations placed upon those pieces of circumstantial evidence, I think, were misinterpreted. I think we're given a skewed representation to the jury. There wasn't any contra indication in relation to those pieces of evidence in terms of having experts look at it. For example, behavioural and clinical psychologists to discuss why people might make notes in relation to their feelings, particularly if under treatment, etc. So to me, none of that added up to Lucy Letby being a murderer, even if we accept the flawed statistical evidence and the now questioned medical evidence. So those are the areas of concern to me, and in particular, the question in my mind is how an investigation, properly managed, properly led, would allow a case to be put before the court that contained all of those flaws. And bottom line, if the investigation had not been conducted in the way that it was, if rational interpretations had been made of the material that was being obtained, it may well be that Lucy wouldn't have been charged and wouldn't have appeared in court, and we wouldn't be in the position that we are today.
Yeah, I agree. So as I was just mentioning earlier, we're going to discuss confirmation bias with regard to several aspects of this investigation and the case as a whole. So let's firstly discuss confirmation bias with regards in the investigation with regard to investigative decision making.
Yeah, so while serving, particularly after I'd gone away and been exposed to the study of investigative psychology when I took a master's in the mid 1990s. I worked really hard with colleagues in the homicide working group and locally, trying to raise awareness in investigators around the importance of an understanding of psychology and psychological issues as far as they affected the investigative process. In particular, how heuristics and biases can affect decision making in investigations and the way in which we make decisions about the activities and intent of others, particularly of witnesses and suspects. So heuristics and biases. Heuristics is, is really sort of a word that describes sort of rules of thumb, shortcuts, mental shortcuts that we have. So, for example, if we're sitting by a campfire at night and we see a movement in the bushes, and we think, crikey, that could be a lion, then we'll immediately get up and run away. Far more effective for the preservation of the species that we make a decision that it's a lion very, very quickly. If it's a false positive, it's no problem. All we've done is just run away into the bushes. If we're right and it is a lion, we perhaps have saved our life and saved, the species going forward. So these are naturally occurring phenomenon for all human beings. We are all subject to heuristics and biases in the way that we make decisions every day. We're always looking for patterns. That's why we see faces in clouds. That's why, in our bedroom at night, we might look across to the wardrobe, and a dressing gown may appear as a hooded man, a hooded spectre or whatever. That's the reason these things happen. And so we've got to be aware that we're subject to these cognitive biases as a result of our human development and our evolution.
Absolutely.
I think there's significant evidence of cognitive bias in the Operation Hummingbird investigation because of the way that the investigation began, and I'll talk about that more in a moment, and because of the way in which it appears that lines of inquiry have not been followed to test other hypotheses. So it's important for an investigation, and in particular those leading the investigation, to recognise the dangers inherent in cognitive biases and heuristics, and to ensure that they have in place structures and mechanisms to continually challenge assumptions and decisions about the way they're investigating, the lines of inquiry that they're following, and the inferences and assumptions that they're making. And that can be as simple as having regular meetings where the boss just says, look, are we going down the right road? We think this. Why do we think it? Where's the evidence? What are the alternative suggestions? What are the alternative scenarios that might have arisen that would lead us to this assumption? What other things could have happened that could lead us to this situation? So it's about that recognition, and it's about maintaining hyper-awareness, if you like, that whatever decision we come to could be flawed because of the way that we as humans look at it, because of the way that humans are always trying to find patterns, are always trying to assemble information, assemble data into coherent narratives. And sometimes there just isn't a coherent narrative. Or sometimes the narrative is actually, the correct narrative is not the one that comes to mind first, and is not the one which is immediately accessible.
Yeah. I'm just going to kick my dog out. Right, let's you out. Come on, move. Oh, wait. Right, you go in there. In. Come on. What do you think? Right. Got rid of it now. Sorry, we'll edit that bit out, probably. Yeah, so I completely agree with you about the pattern issue and how that can be a massive problem. And I think it's very clear that because of this statistical thing, they just, they fastened onto one explanation, and then they never considered anything else. That's how it seems to me, and I think that's how it seems to a lot of people that have seen the Operation Hummingbird film. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I do. I think there is a point that we can identify, and I think it's the meeting on the 15th of May 2017, when Doctors Breary, Holt, and J Rām meet with Detective Chief Superintendent Wenham, and then DI Paul Hughes, who then went on to be Detective Superintendent SIO in relation to Operation Hummingbird. I think it was that point at which they decided that there was evidence that the babies had been killed or unlawfully injured, and that probably Lucy Letby was the person that had done that. And from that point, things moved forward at a pace, and it seems to me that that was the hypothesis that was taken forward, and that there was very little challenge to that hypothesis. And in terms of evidence for that, I cite again, the fact that Jane Hutton wasn't engaged, and her alternative view wasn't put into the investigation and wasn't put before the jury. So just sort of staying with the cognitive bias issue at the moment, and how it should be managed. This concept shouldn't be alien to investigators. As I mentioned earlier on, myself and others did a lot of work to try and raise awareness. There are a number of documents. I mentioned already the murder investigation manual in relation to how to set out, how to structure, how to organise investigations, in particular homicide investigations. But in relation to all investigative practice, there's a national document called the Core Investigative Doctrine, issued now by the College of Policing. It's available on the internet, and it sets out the foundational principles of effective, efficient, and ethical investigation at all levels, from the most straightforward to the most difficult and complex. It reinforces the Criminal Procedure and Investigation Act of 1996, which is a piece of legislation which places a statutory duty on investigators, on the police, to conduct an even-handed and balanced investigation following all reasonable lines of inquiry, whether that line of inquiry points towards the suspect, a particular suspect, or whether it points away. So something we'll discuss a bit later. The Core Investigative Doctrine, in fact, has a chapter 5, which clearly identifies the dangers associated with psychological biases and how to minimise those effects. So one of the things it says very, very clearly, it introduces a mantra, if you like, which I was very keen to make sure was repeated over and over again to investigators that I work with and who work for me. In order to minimise the negative effects of biases and heuristics, it's important the investigator assumes nothing, believes nothing, and challenges everything. And that relates to every piece of evidence, every theory. So don't just assume because you're talking to somebody, and they're well qualified, that what they're saying is credible. Don't believe somebody because they're passionate and driven. UK policing went through a horrendous period. You'll recall, when people like, the informant Carl, was believed in relation to historical sex abuse issues, which we've now found were complete fabrication on his part. That was because there was a mantra in policing of always believe the victim, which at the time, I raised my head above the parapet and said, that's got to be wrong. Yes, listen to the victim, treat the victim with respect, give the victim support, conduct the investigation. Don't believe anything. That's not the job of an investigator. It's not the job of the police. The job of the police is to gather evidence and put that before the Crown Prosecution Service and eventually before the court. It's of no interest, it's of no import what the police believe. And as I say, everything must be challenged. It's ABC, assume nothing, believe nothing, and challenge everything. I'm not sure that happened in this case.
Yeah, there was even this incident recently with this girl who said she'd had some horrible. We better not discuss this explicitly, but she'd had She said she'd had some horrible things happen to her and she'd hit herself with a hammer. I don't know if you'd seen that case, and she's now in prison. But I think someone else went to prison in that case. She, I don't even know her name, but I read about it, and that was a case of victim believing the victim, but actually there was no victim. She made the whole thing up.
Yeah,
So it's an interesting phenomenon.
yeah.
Um, so have you covered confirmation bias with regard to safeguards? Would you like to discuss that further?
Yeah, I think the point I'd like to make there is, I suppose I mentioned the internal safeguards that there should be applied um, to ensure that investigations don't run down an inappropriate path, are not um, subsumed by confirmation bias. You know, the ABC methodology, the regular reviews. I think there's another level of safeguard, and that's in relation to the court itself. You know, so far as I understand, the court has had no insight really in how this investigation was constructed. Now, the way an investigation is constructed and led, you know, has an enormous impact upon the evidence that's put before the jury, and as we've seen, the inferences and assessments that are made. On many occasions, when I was SIO in investigations, including homicide investigations, I was put in the witness box to give an account of how I'd led the investigation, to demonstrate that I'd been open minded, that I'd followed all reasonable lines of inquiry, that I challenged all the evidence, that I developed rational hypotheses about narratives and about sequences of events, and that I tested them appropriately. You know, I can remember instances where we had charged an individual of murder, and then we'd sat down and said, right, okay, is there anyone else? Is there any other scenario that could have led to this woman being killed in a home at this particular time? And we found one other individual who had been behaving oddly, some miles away from the scene, had blood on his clothing, had knocked on someone's door to use their telephone. We did an enormous amount of work to find that person and to establish what had happened. We found eventually that the blood was actually animal blood, and there'd been a whole sort of sequence of events which had nothing to do with our investigation. We had young officers, young fit officers instructed to run as fast as they could from the location where he was seen to the location of the murder, see whether it's humanly possible to get between the two locations in the time. You know, we went to the nth degree to eliminate that person as potentially being the murderer, as opposed to the person that we had an enormous amount of evidence was the murderer. So it's not uncommon. It's really not uncommon for senior investigating officers and senior people within the investigation team to be put to the test to explain how the investigation was conducted and what they did to ensure that this wasn't just a witch hunt for the suspect, for the defendant in the box. This was an open investigation. This was an ethical investigation, and it was wide ranging. And when all the evidence is gathered together, it pointed towards this individual, this before the court on that particular occasion. And on those occasions, I would regularly refer to my policy documentation. So any decision that the senior investigating officer in particular makes in the investigation to do, or as importantly, not to do something, is written down. It's recorded in a decision log. So the decision is recorded and the rationale for that decision. So it might be, well, there will be an entry that says, we're going to declare this a major investigation and we're going to investigate the deaths and injuries of these children from the Countess of Chester Hospital. And underneath that, there'll be a paragraph or two which will explain the rationale for doing so. And then at every point during the investigation, there will be records made of what the decisions were and why the decisions were taken. There will be minutes of meetings, management meetings and team meetings within the investigation where the lines of inquiry will be discussed, where the actions arising from those lines of inquiry will be discussed, where there should be challenges around the developing evidence, discussed. All that material is available. Now, all that I'm saying today and all that I've been able to say recently is based upon what is public material that is publicly available. I think in order to understand how Operation Hummingbird was conducted and whether or not, my hypothesis that it's been subject inappropriately and detrimentally to confirmation bias is correct. It may be that all these safeguards were put in place. It may be that we'll find documentation that indicates that the senior investigating officer was very aware of confirmation bias and was on a regular basis challenging assumptions, etc., etc. But we don't know because nobody's seen this material. All that material is available, and I think this is material that Mark MacDonald and his team should be asking Cheshire Police for. It's regularly disclosed and produced in cases, all over the country, going back years. So it's available. It wouldn't be a precedent to release it. It's not material that is sensitive outside of people with a need to know, including the defence. So I think in order to test whether or not this investigation was properly conducted, I think it's really important for that material to be accessed and to be analysed.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's interesting. But to change tack slightly, we're going to discuss the meeting that many viewers will know about that took place on the 15th of May with Cheshire Police, Dr Daly and Dr J Rām. And I often don't mention that Dr Susie Holt was there as well, so I should mention that she was present. Now, within just 3 days of this meeting, having previously indicated that they had no intention of investigating, Cheshire Police then contacted the Guardian. We don't know exactly what date they did contact the Guardian, but the Guardian reported on the investigation on the 18th of May. So the latest possible date is the 18th. They may have contacted the Guardian before the 18th. So just in a matter of days, they went from we're not going to have an investigation to we're going to tell the media that we are having an investigation. So I found this a little strange, regardless of any other issue related to the investigation. And I just wanted to ask you, wouldn't it be more logical to have a quiet period of contemplation in the background before you do anything like this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was happening. Prior to the 15th of May 2017, there had been a number of meetings between the County of Chester Hospital, senior management, and Cheshire Police. And it was moving forward at what appears to me from the records and minutes of meetings that I've seen, it was being treated very sensibly, very, very rationally and very calmly. The board of the hospital had understandably asked questions around, well, where's the evidence? We understand your concerns. We understand the inferences that the consultants are drawing, but point us to the evidence, that these babies have been unlawfully harmed or killed, and B, that Lucy Letby is probably the person that did this. And the police are asking the same questions. And there are minutes of a meeting on the 12th of May where exactly these things are being said. And I forget the name of the gentleman, but the assistant chief constable. So it's being dealt with at the appropriate level. There was an assistant chief constable involved, a chief officer. So at a strategic level, Cheshire Police were engaged, were discussing at a strategic level how to move this forward with the County of Chester Hospital. And during the meeting of the 12th of May, Cheshire Police were asking the same question. We're saying, well, we need to see some evidence of these assertions. And we haven't seen that yet. And the whole tenet of the meeting appeared to be that they were looking at saying, well, if we don't get this evidence, we're not looking at this as an investigation. We don't see it as a rationale to move forward, to commit resources, etc., in terms of investigation. And then, as you say, 6 days after that, the 18th, there's an announcement to the press, to the Guardian, that this investigation is taking place. So up until the 12th, it appears that everybody's doing really what we'd expect them to do in terms of, as you say, in a mature and rational way, reflecting on the evidence and making a decision as to a way forward. Why the press were notified on the 18th, I've no idea. Being charitable, it may be that they've been putting pressure on Cheshire Police already. They may have picked up from another source. A lot of people knew that this was bubbling at the Cancer Chester Hospital, and it may well be that the media had picked up that there were concerns around the deaths of babies, that an individual has been identified potentially as causing those deaths, and they may well have been on to Cheshire Police saying, "What are you doing? What's happening?" So that may well be why they engaged with the press. So it may not be that they felt the need to advertise it. It may well be that they just felt the need to respond, and that's a real pressure, which I can understand they want to respond to. My concern, however, is around a meeting that took place between the 12th of May and the 18th of May, and that was on the 15th. And that was a meeting which was known about at the 12th of May discussions. There was a conversation there where they were talking about Detective Chief Superintendent Wenham had been contacted by Dr Breary, who'd asked for a meeting to discuss the issues. And at the meeting of the 12th of May, it was resolved that that meeting would go ahead, that, this is our position at the moment. We don't really think there's enough evidence to conduct an investigation, but we'll hold fire until Nigel Wenham has had this conversation with Dr Breary, and we'll see, whether there's any feedback from that. This meeting takes place on the 15th of May. Dr Breary, Dr J Rām, Dr Holt, Detective Chief Superintendent Wenham, and then Detective Inspector, later Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, Nigel Wenham is, from what I say, I don't know him, I've never come across him, but he's clearly a very experienced, very senior detective. I mean, a Detective Chief Superintendent is a very senior detective. When I was Detective Chief Superintendent, I was running the Criminal Investigation Department for one of the larger non-metropolitan police forces in the country. It's a big deal. Okay, Detective Chief Superintendents are very influential people within an organisation, and that's important to bear in mind.
Yeah, that's.
Sorry,
No, continue. Sorry.
So Nigel Wenham gives an insight into this meeting in evidence that he gave to the Thirlwell inquiry on the 20th of November of 2024. And when I read that, it was a light bulb moment, if you like, in terms of how we got from the 12th of May, where everyone's behaving very rationally and are kicking around to try and find some evidence, to launching a major investigation on or around the 18th. So he said at the Thirlwell inquiry, the meeting was, I can't describe how powerful it was. They were knowledgeable. They spoke from the points of view whereby they were dealing with these things real time, and they have lived and breathed these events for the last several years. I just felt for those professionals there. They had the opportunity now to speak to someone, to be listened to and be believed. And what they were saying, it felt as though they were not just going to push them away like they've been pushed in the past, or threatened or intimidated, which is the perception they had. So what he said there, he was clearly emotionally affected by this. The evidence he gave was very powerful and very emotive. But the key issue he said there to me was they've been listened to and believed. So what that's saying to me is that Nigel Wenham is believing these doctors. Now, on an individual personal basis, not an issue with that. On the basis that this was a very experienced, very senior police officer within Cheshire Police. On the 15th of May 2017, he is clearly emotionally invested in what these doctors are saying, and he is saying in terms that he believes. And we've got to take this seriously. What he said, he's saying this in a public inquiry, in open court in a public inquiry. So he must have thought very carefully about what he was going to say and about how he was going to represent how he felt at that time. And as I said earlier on, there are real dangers as an investigator for the investigation when you start to believe, particularly if you believe unequivocally what people are telling you. Yes, listen to it, take it on board, examine it, challenge it, and use it as evidence if it's appropriate. But I think at an early stage, when a very senior officer who's very clearly influential within the organisation believes that the narrative that these doctors have constructed is right, i.e., that babies have been killed or unlawfully harmed, and that Lucy Letby is responsible, because all of those things were mentioned in that meeting. I think that's a real concern, and I think that's the point at which Operation Hummingbird began to go down the path of being an investigation led by confirmation bias, where it was looking for evidence that confirmed the hypothesis that these babies had been unlawfully killed or harmed, and that Lucy Letby was the killer.
Yeah, I personally find it extraordinary that when I first saw the Operation Hummingbird film, they made it sound in that film very much like they became too emotionally involved with the parents and almost viewed the parents as a customer that they needed to serve. I didn't know at that time that they'd basically done the same thing with the consultants. I can't understand how, as you say, how they can stand up at public inquiry and say, basically what they're saying is, oh, we made the consultants happy. They weren't happy, and then we made them happy, so we've done our job. Whereas clearly that's obviously not your job. Clearly, obviously, your job is to investigate the situation dispassionately, not think, oh, this person's turned up in our police station, so now we need to make sure that they're satisfied. I mean, it's just very, very strange. Um,
Well, yeah, well, that's right. And phrases like, they felt they hadn't been believed or hadn't been listened to. They've been, suggesting they've been intimidated. All very emotive stuff, which I think is entirely inappropriate for somebody in that position to be saying. I mean, you mentioned the parents, and yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's important that empathy is demonstrated to them as parents of children who've died or have been injured. And yes, they are, want a better phrase, customers of the investigation and need to be treated with sensitivity and respect and provided support. All of those things are entirely appropriate. And to listen to what they've got to say, listen to their story. They're important witnesses in terms of how their babies were treated and all the key issues in relation to the investigation. But that doesn't mean, again, that you assume anything, that you believe everything that you're told, and you don't challenge the evidence that you're receiving. So it is a fine balancing act. So the doctors need to be treated with dignity and respect. But that doesn't mean to say you believe everything they say. The families have got to be treated with sensitivity, dignity, respect, and provided support. But again, you don't have to believe everything that they say. And that's where the borders, if you like, started to merge between a clear, broad-based investigation and something that was more about confirming narratives and driving forward a campaign almost to bring Lucy Letby to what they saw as justice.
yeah, absolutely. So we're going to go back to that meeting on the 15th of May in a bit, but firstly, another key component of this whole police situation is the selection of Dr. Daly Evans as an expert witness, which would prove to be very, very bad for Lucy Letby in the end. So do you have an opinion on, I guess, his suitability, but also the way that he was selected as an expert witness?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing to me is just very, very odd. I've been involved over the years in using hundreds of experts, and it's always difficult. Um, Most experts in their field are very reluctant to give evidence for the police, to analyse material and give evidence. You know, they want to carry on doing what they do, their research, the stuff they're doing in the community, particularly in the medical field. That's their core business, not being a witness for the police. So very often it's really difficult to find witnesses who are willing to come forward. And it's particularly difficult for the defence in those circumstances. We'll perhaps talk about that later. There are also difficulties around, and there have been for years, around who is an expert, why do we think they're an expert, how are they validated, and how are they used? And that really hasn't been resolved since I was involved in the field many years ago. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done around that. I was really interested by the comments of Anna Doherty, you spoke to a few days ago, around potentially using expert advisors for the investigation, for the judge, even for the jury, potentially to give a rationality around expert views. But anyway, the way that Daly Evans was recruited was very odd. I've never come across it before. I've come across scenarios where senior investigating officers, and there is a coterie, if you like, of SIOs across the country. A lot of SIOs will know each other, particularly within geographical regions. And I've been on the phone to a colleague SIO when I've been when I've known that they've used a particular expert and said, what do you think of this person? Were they, easy to work with? Were you happy with the product, etc. So that I would understand. But for an expert to put themselves into the scenario, I would say it was very, very rare. And for me, it would raise red flags. Why is this person, flagging themselves up as wanting to be involved? So I want, proper validation to be done around this individual. Some of the concerns that I have around Daly Evans, and again, I don't want to be ad hominem. He's had a very long and eminent career. But when I've seen, and we've all seen Daly Evans a lot in the comments he's giving, particularly subsequent to the trial, which is surprising to me. It's very unusual for experts to comment at all, let alone comment extensively after the trial. But the way that he conducts himself, and I have to say, it comes across to me as a professional arrogance. He's not prepared to listen to the views of others. Some of the disparaging ways that he has commented about others who might have a different view in relation to the material that he's analysed, I think is really troubling. Almost the extent of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know if you're aware of the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a psychological principle whereby generally the more confident somebody is about an issue, the less likely they are to be correct about it. To the extent that the more you know about something in any field, the more you are aware of nuances, of different points of view. For me, an expert being 100%, I am completely convinced that this is how this happened, would again raise red flags. I'm far more convinced by somebody like Mike Hall, who was going to be a defence witness, who understandably says, well, I think this may have happened here, I'm not quite so sure here, and I think there are a number of explanations in this area. That to me is far more convincing. So I'm not going to go any further down that road. I think there are real concerns over the way that he was recruited and over the way that he has behaved subsequently. I think another thing that concerns me is a comment he made. I'm not quite sure where it was, but it's quite well known. Is around I've never lost a case.
Mm.
The position of an expert isn't to win or lose cases. And I think this is one of the problems inherent with the situation we have now. in relation to experts being called for one side or another. And that suggested that Daly Evans felt that he was part of the prosecution team, and that it was part of his job to prove the case, rather than give an independent assessment to assist the court. And I think there's a lot of work needs to be done in relation to experts, the way they're used and the way that they see themselves. It's unfortunate there was a report in 2011, recommendations for reform of expert witnesses. I hope now that one of the results of this process is that some of those recommendations are implemented. So getting back to the way that he was recruited, for some years, there's been a national database, if you like, national registry of experts in relation to all sorts of disciplines. And I recall that being set up. And that was to try and to try and reduce the burden of investigators having to go out every time, do the independent research, go to rural colleges or whatever to identify an expert for, whether it be a soil expert, whether it be an anthropologist, whether it be a doctor or whatever. A range of experts were brought together. There was some work done, I understand it, around some sort of light touch validation of those experts, but the validation often was done by them being used by a particular SIO, and that SIO being satisfied or not with their work. So the way in which the experts should have been sourced would have been to go through the National Crime Agency, who are the custodians now of that list. The National Crime Agency has an office there where there are senior investigating officer advisors who are available to give advice across a range of issues in relation to the investigation. And one of those things is around the provision of expert advice. So that body should have been the one that should have been contacted by Operation Hummingbird, and through interaction with that body, the experts should have been identified and appointed. That wasn't done in this case. There was communication between them, but in the event, the only expert for a long time in the investigation was Daly Evans.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to discuss this a bit more in relation to the meeting that occurred on the 15th of May that we've already mentioned with Dr J Rām, Dr Breary and Dr Holt. Now, during this meeting, Dr J Rām essentially informs Cheshire Police that they need to conduct a multidisciplinary investigation. Now, why he won't go to a medical authority and ask them to do that, why he went to police is not entirely clear, but he nevertheless gave this advice, which was reasonable advice. Now, I know that Steve has seen evidence that the police were told after this by an external agency or external communication, he can explain more, that indeed they should hold a multidisciplinary investigation. So obviously we know that didn't happen. So could you discuss this, and could you tell us more about the role of Dr Evans and what he told the police in relation to this?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, you're right. In that meeting on the 15th, an important thing that Dr J Rām said was, that in his view there ought to be a multi-agency review, and that's absolutely right. It's almost common sense, but it's an important comment to make, and it's clear that he does say that. As I mentioned earlier on, in addition to maintaining this list of experts, another role of the NCA is to provide an office which gives wider support to senior investigating officers. And at an early stage, Operation Hummingbird were in communication with that office. In addition to passing the details of Dr Evans, so Dr Evans got in touch with his friend at the National Injuries Database, which is another part of the NCA, offered himself up, and then that offer was passed on to Hummingbird through the NCA SIO Expert Advisor Office. So they did that, but at the same time, they gave advice, very clear advice, to the SIO in Operation Hummingbird in writing that they needed a panel of relevant experts, not just a single expert. So if you like, the two things are running in tandem. And it's almost, the way I read it is it's almost as if, well, we've got this person putting themselves forward, we'll let them know that. But actually, what you need to know is you need these experts. And on the 26th of May, so this is very early into the inquiry, 26th of May 2017, there's a communication between the NCA and Hummingbird, and the NCA say you need to appoint a panel of relevant experts, and they are forensic and neonatal pathologists, forensic toxicologist or a clinical pharmacologist, a nurse with experience of special baby units for neonates, a medical expert with experience of the working practices on a special unit for neonates, an obstetrician, and also experts to review the medical statistics. So right at the start of the investigation, the advice that Hummingbird is receiving, firstly, sort of, if you like, informally through Dr J Rām, but formally from this expert body, is that they need this panel, not just a single expert. And then 2 days later, on the 28th of June, the NCA followed it up with a list of potential experts. So not only are they saying, right, okay, just generally you need experts in this field, they've gone away and they've identified individuals to fulfill each of those roles. And that's consolidated with a further list on the 4th of July. You know, so they're quite insistent. Understandably and properly, they do couch their advice in terms of, well, this is your decision, but our advice is you need to appoint these experts. It doesn't seem that the respondents from Operation Hummingbird really pick up on this. You know, I've seen the to and fro conversation by email, and they don't seem very. Really don't seem to pick up on the need for this panel. They seem more focused upon making arrangements to see Daly Evans. And then there's no further discussion. I can't find any further discussion of the need for a panel. I think there was a conversation, may have been a conversation between Operation Hummingbird and Daly Evans about a panel, because he writes a letter on the 18th of July, quite a long letter. And in that letter, he says, I do not think it's necessary to consider additional expert opinion at this stage. So that suggested to me that it had been broached with him. Somebody might have said, well, look, Dr. Evans, you know, we need some other experts here, don't we? And he's saying, no, don't worry about it. I've got this. You know, I don't need any additional expert opinion. And Hummingbird evidently go along with that, because the only additional experts that they appoint, that we know of, appear to have been appointed to review and validate the work done by Daly Evans. Now, the best practice advice that the NCA were trying to give to Operation Hummingbird is about a panel where the individuals on that panel, with their different expertises, their different disciplines, will review the material separately, will come to a decision individually from their point of view about whether the baby's died unlawfully, whether, you know, what the cause of death or injury was, and then they come together as in a collegiate body and will discuss and moderate their views, all entirely understandable and acceptable, and very robust, very robust. I've used this methodology on a number of occasions, you know, and sometimes you get one expert, you know, who has different views from others, and they maintain that view. Other times you'll have an expert who may take a particular view, and then after the moderation say, actually, you know, now we've discussed it, and I can see it from your perspective, from your discipline. Yeah, I think, you know, that probably is right. You know, all open, all completely ethical in terms of ensuring that the right people have the right information, that those people have got the right skills to assess it, and we're not relying on the opinion of one individual, which is what seems to have occurred in this instance, and then have that opinion validated by others, rather than independent reviews of the material. And I think if there was a turning point, a catalyst point really for the investigation itself, that's the 15th of May, when the decision was taken after the meeting with the consultants to actually launch an investigation. If there's a turning point for the gathering of evidence, particularly medical evidence, I think it's here on the 18th of July, when Evans convinces Operation Hummingbird that the only expert they need is him, and that they move forward on that basis. Now, there is a role within investigations called the expert advisor. And the expert advisor can also be an expert witness. They can, look at the material and give advice to the police as to where they need to go to get other information, which will help, to understand the situation, to give a view. And they can later on go along and give a witness statement as well and be an expert witness. But there are very, very strict conditions around how an expert advisor is used. And there is a document, again, available on the internet around how expert advisors are used in major crime investigations. And it talks about the role of the expert advisor as distinct from an expert witness, and their role in providing advice and direction to the investigation. So I'm not sure that there was much thought on Operation Hummingbird about Daly Evans's role. I think in some cases, he assumes this role of being an expert advisor in terms of advising the police where to go to get information. And on other occasions, he morphs into being an expert witness in terms of providing them the evidence to move the investigation forward. The whole thing appears to be confused. It was confused from the start when he popped himself up to be the witness. And I think it's really troubling that the advice they were being given by the NCA was the right advice, it accorded with best practice, and they decided not to go with it, and they were, if you like, I think, overawed by Daly Evans and his apparent confidence in his own ability.
Well, I mean that's how many times? How many they let the consultants walk in and just say whatever they want, they just accept it. They let this guy walk in, they just accept it. I mean, are any of them going to ask any critical questions at any point? I mean, it is staggering. It's absolutely staggering. You could, because I obviously I kind of viewed it in a detached way and thought maybe they didn't properly understand that they had to do a multidisciplinary investigation. That's being generous, because J Rām told them and they should know anyway. But to be told twice and to ignore that twice and to just have some retired paediatrician walk in and say, "Oh, I can do everything, don't worry." I mean, shouldn't I just cannot understand how you would think, all right, we'll accept that, and we'll just ignore the fact that there are all these medical disciplines and specialisms that exist. We'll just completely ignore that and just let him do everything. I just can't imagine or understand how you could get to that conclusion.
No, I agree. I mean, I'm astonished. I'm trying to be as charitable as I can to people. But no, I agree, Chris. I'm completely astonished as to how they got themselves in that position, and how it persisted. I mean, this wasn't an investigation that was strapped for cash, that was low on resources. It was very well resourced. I think they went to the Home Office and asked for additional funds, which is something that's open to police forces. If they get an investigation which is beyond what they could normally expect to have to deal with within their own resources. And I think the Home Office gave them an injection of funds to keep the operation running as they wanted to. So, the SIO had available all the resources that he wanted and that he needed. So certainly, instructing a panel of experts would have been, not an issue as far as saving money. I can't believe that would be the issue. I think the explanation lies elsewhere, and I struggle to find it.
So another thing I want to emphasize is that we've discussed this previously on the channel, but when Lucy was arrested for the first time in 2018, we know because Paul Hughes told Liz Hull, Paul Hughes led the investigation, of course, that Lucy was arrested only on the evidence of Dr. Evans. None of, even though Steve has explained quite rightly that the other experts were directed very much, when she was first arrested, they hadn't even been directed. They hadn't even looked at the case. Only the evidence of Dr. Evans was available at that time. So, and he also indicated that he basically made his mind up that Lucy was guilty at that point as well. So, do you have any comment to make on this?
Yeah, I can't recall that comment being made by Paul Hughes. I'm sure that it was. I'm surprised it was made, because the decision to make an arrest is a tactical one for the SIO, and in terms of the necessity for it, the timing, etc. Where they are with building the evidence. I don't criticise the decision to arrest in those terms. I don't know enough about what the evidence was that was in front of them in terms of being able to say whether or not it was the right time to arrest. I assume they would have considered other methodologies. It's not always necessary to arrest somebody. It's clear that at some stage Lucy was going to have to be spoken to about this. There's no question, on whatever assessment you make around the evidence, around the suggestions of her involvement. At some stage, this investigation having been launched, she was going to have to be asked to sit down and have a conversation with the police about the issues. It's not necessary to arrest somebody for that. Again, the documentation would tell us, the decision documentation would tell us why they decided to go down the route of arrest rather than making an arrangement for her to come to a police station with a solicitor and sit down and be interviewed under caution, which is one option open to them. It may be that they decided that it was important that once she was arrested, that her premises were searched, and I know that quite an extensive search was carried out. And when somebody is arrested for an arrestable offence, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act give powers to the police to search any premises at which they're arrested or any premises that they reside at or have custody or control of. So once you've arrested somebody, then you can immediately conduct a search without a warrant. But if you decide to interview somebody under caution and you still want to search the premises, given the level of the evidence at this stage, they could have gone to a magistrate and got a warrant. All those issues would have been considered, and there will be documents as to why they went in a particular direction.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fair. So another kind of blunder or kind of inexplicable aspect of the investigation, depending on how you look at it, was that numerous important lines of inquiry were seemingly ignored. The first of these is the context of the hospital, which we now know a lot about. So could you give us your opinion on that, firstly?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the core investigative doctrine and the Criminal Procedures and Investigation Act of 1996 place on the police an obligation to follow all reasonable lines of inquiry in the investigation, whether they point towards a particular suspect or away from them. So it's about the investigation developing these hypotheses. What do we think's happened here? And what evidence do we need to find in order to test that hypothesis? If the single hypothesis you develop is that these babies have been killed and unlawfully injured, and that Lucy Letby's done it, then clearly that's going to focus your investigation in one direction. Where are we going to find the evidence that Lucy Letby did this? There were other potential hypotheses, and we know about all of these now, don't we? The sewage coming back into the ward and the potential effects of Pseudomonas, the treatment of the babies, the ward rounds, 2 ward rounds a week as opposed to 2 a day, the staffing, the level of acuity, the level of risk that babies presented because of the fact they were very very short term, and a number of them were very ill. So there were lots and lots of other potential hypotheses as to how these babes had died. Now, at an early stage, my understanding is that Daly Evans, that the police were relying on, had in terms excluded all of the other possibilities. And in fact, I think he said in terms that the reason he's arrived at a number of his diagnoses for death, for unlawful death, was because everything else could be excluded. So I understand that that might be an inhibition for the police to go down these lines. You know, it might well have been that there was a discussion, well, should we go and look at whether or not there's evidence that this Pseudomonas killed any of these children? Well, there's no point because Daly's told us that that's not an issue, so we're not going to go down that path. That might have happened. But clearly, whatever Daly Evans had said, when we think back to assuming nothing, believing nothing, and challenging everything, whatever he'd said, they should have looked very, very closely at the other potential causes of injury and death. And I'm not sure they did. But certainly that wasn't presented in evidence because the SIO didn't give evidence, and we've not seen any of the internal documentation. So as I said earlier on, that's why it's really, really essential that Mark McDonald and his team get access to that documentation and it's properly analysed in order that we can, very clearly understand whether or not these other lines of inquiry were pursued or whether they were put to one side.
Yeah, I mean, it seems unlikely that they were considered because they've just got this one guy in there who's saying the same thing over and over again. So, from what we know about Dr. Daly Evans, everything I've studied, all the indications that he's given, it very much points to the impression that he never considered anything other than possible malfeasance. He just tried to look at every possible explanation for malfeasance. He didn't look for natural causes. I mean, he will occasionally protest against that, but there's just simply no evidence they ever did that. I mean, that's reflected in court as well because he doesn't make criticisms of processes. He doesn't make criticisms of medical errors. He doesn't make criticisms of the hospital. So I think it's very likely that, and we don't know because we haven't got the documents, but I don't think they did look at other medical explanations based on what we know.
No, and we're just speculating, aren't we? Really, because
Yeah.
as I say, we haven't got access to those notes.
Yes.
But I really do wonder whether they placed so much faith in Daly Evans, and he had excluded all these other causes, potential causes, that's why they potentially decided not to go down that road.
Well, to be fair, I mean, I'm not saying this to be disrespectful. I think this is just a fact. I think some of the diagnoses that the panel have come up with, he wouldn't even know them. I mean, I just don't think he'd be capable of doing it. If you look at I mean, I've seen his report, one of the reports he's written, or a kind of general report. If you compare those to the panel reports are so forensic and focusing on really specific things. I just don't think he had the capabilities of finding those things. I mean, the active paediatricians who worked on the unit, who were actually in a hospital, Dr. Evans had been in the hospital for 10 years at this point. Even at the start of the investigation, even they couldn't recognise some of these subtle signatures. And partly that's due to lack of ward rounds. It's due to failures on the unit, etc., etc. But it's also due to gaps in their ability and understanding. And I just don't think he would have been able to recognise some of these things. But
he had a particular skill set, didn't he? He's clearly has had a profession where he's been very successful, and his skill set is around paediatric care. You can't argue with that.
No.
But the other things that need to be picked up, I think, would have been picked up by this panel because you would have had on that panel, people who understood nursing care, people who understood, from a neonatologist point of view, the issues within the unit, who would have understood the issues around infection. So I don't think it's just down to Evans as a character. I think it's also down to the fact that they'd engaged one person from one particular discipline.
Yeah.
and has relied upon him, for a lot of the investigation in terms of their decision making. Again, we get into this issue of, was he an expert? Was he an advisor?
Mm.
Probably a bit of both.
Mm. So that brings us neatly onto the obstetric notes and neonatal medical police questionnaires. This is another important line of inquiry that was ignored. And just to clarify this, I've already on this channel been over the court case where you can see there's almost no discussion of obstetrics whatsoever. But we now know that the notes were not part of the investigation and were not part of the prosecution case. That's just a fact. So, could you tell us a little bit more about that and your view on that, please?
Well, again, that's astonishing. I think the more so, and I hadn't realised the significance of not having an obstetrician um, in the investigation or reviewing the obstetric notes. Following your interview with, I forget the name of the guy, the obstetrician, where he demonstrated what really should be common sense, shouldn't it? That the way in which a mother, the journey of a mother's birth and the way in which a child is born will have a significant effect, a critical effect on how they survive, particularly as neonates into the future. And it was really powerful, the discussion you had with him about the importance of obstetric and an obstetric understanding and an obstetric review of these cases. And of course, when we think back to that list of experts that the NCA provided, amongst those was obstetrician. So they'd identified that that particular category, that discipline, needed to be included in an expert panel, and they went on to identify an obstetrician who could fulfil that role, and that wasn't picked up. So I think there are real issues in relation to the fact that an obstetrician wasn't used to review these notes, along with all of the other disciplines that were offered to Operation Hummingbird within a week of them starting their investigation.
Yeah. Now, to change tack somewhat, this was something that really interested me that you had to say when I first met you, because everyone now has seen the footage of Lucy being dragged out of her house in Cheshire. Now, I hate to watch that now, given how much I know about the case. It's horrible. But even from the first time that I saw it, I thought, is it really entirely necessary to handcuff her? But I'm not a police officer. I know very little about police procedures. I thought maybe there was some reason for this, maybe it was normal practice and so on. But I know that you're critical of this, so could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was horrified by the images. I'm not sure who took them, whether it's media or whether it was a police video, but I think it was a second arrest where she was taken out of the house, handcuffed behind her back, led to a vehicle which is just a few feet away, and then the ridiculous scene of her trying to get in the back of a vehicle but not being able to do so because she had handcuffs around her back, and then the images stop, and presumably she had the handcuffs removed so she could get into the vehicle. Absolutely horrified. Now, as we've established, I've run a lot of operations, and a lot of operations involving very dangerous people, very volatile people. I've been, a junior police officer responsible for arresting people who have been violent and aggressive. So handcuffs have their place. They are part of the protective equipment that police officers carry in order to keep themselves, the public, and often the suspect safe. But the application of force by the police is very strictly controlled. And the use of handcuffs is an application of force. And any application of force has got to be lawful, justified, necessary, and proportionate. So it's only lawful if it's necessary, justified, and proportionate. So what was the necessity? What was the justification? And how proportionate was it for a young woman who had no background of aggression or indeed violence towards anybody, including the police, albeit she was suspected of harming babies, but these were small neonate babies. How likely was it that she was going to, using the police vernacular, kick off and become a problem and be a danger to the officers, to members of the public who may be close, or to herself? Really unlikely.
I mean, almost none, basically. We can basically say zero.
I would say so. And you had, I don't know how many police officers there. Some of them were in uniform and would have been carrying protective equipment in terms of CS spray, in terms of batons and handcuffs. So they could have responded pretty quickly. All that was necessary was for Lucy to be led from her home, perhaps somebody have a hand on her arm or whatever, that's the normal way of doing it, to be led to the vehicle and driven away. Had I been responsible for that operation, then there would have been a very detailed operation plan. The plan would have been drawn up as to who was going to go where, who was going to be, speaking to Lucy, who was going to be speaking the words of arrest, who was going to go into the premises, who was going to control the premises, who was going to do the search. It would have been a very extensive briefing document. And somewhere within that document would be a decision as to whether or not she was going to be handcuffed. So it'd be really interesting to see that documentation and understand the rationale as to why they thought it was necessary, justified, and proportionate to handcuff, a pretty slight young woman to walk a couple of yards from a front door to the back of a police car. I would, if I'd have had it, if it was suggested to me as the commander of operation that we were going to handcuff this person, I'd have said, no, we're not. That's not going to happen. That's ridiculous. She's a young woman. There's no history of anything that might give us concern. It'd be totally disproportionate to do so, and you're not doing it. So I'm just astonished of those images. I'm not suggesting it was the case, but it raises concerns in my mind as to whether or not there was a performative element there, and whether or not it goes to a wider mindset of the investigation. We're dealing with this dreadful person, this evil person, and perhaps subconsciously they feel that was a necessity to handcuff her. But I think it's a really important moment, in demonstrating the attitude of the investigation. And in my view, I think completely inappropriate.
Yeah, so you mentioned this performative element. So that seemed to be inherent in the digging up of her garden and so forth. And certainly Peter Hitchens has suggested that this was just done to identify her to the press. So how do you feel about that as well?
Yeah, I can understand why people might say that, but I haven't got as many concerns about that as I have the handcuffing issue.
Mm.
This was a very significant police investigation. It had to be done properly. I can see myself in similar circumstances authorising a full search that might involve excavation of the garden. Particularly if there were concerns that she might have disposed of property, of evidence that might be relevant. So I haven't got so many concerns about that. I don't think that holds up really as a performative issue, but I understand what Peter might say about it.
Okay, that's fine. So I want to ask about behavioural interpretation. So you mentioned to me, I absolutely agree with this, that behavioural interpretations are not reliable indicators of guilt, despite the comments of certain journalists. So could you expand on that for us, please?
Well, this is really, really troubling. And again, it goes to something we all think we can do. We all think we're good, but understanding the intentions, the inner mind, the inner world of other people. And all the psychological research indicates we just can't. I'm looking at you now, and you look, pretty relaxed, pretty calm, pretty confident. But I don't know that's the case. And I'm making those assessments not just on the basis of your appearance to me, but the context. The fact that we've spoken previously, so I've got a bit of an understanding of how you behaved previously. The communications we've had. It's all brought together to give me an assessment of the sort of person you are and how you're feeling at the moment. It could be complete nonsense. Within your mind at the moment, you could be in complete turmoil about something I know nothing about. Um, I'm astonished that the police and the prosecution have made the comments that they have. Perhaps less astonished because they've got to sell newspapers and podcasts that some of the journalists have made the comments they have. But some of the nonsense that has been talked about Lucy Letby's behaviour and linking that to, inferences around whether or not she's guilty, whether it's the sort of way that a person would behave, or whether an innocent person would behave in another way, is just dangerous nonsense. It's dangerous nonsense because it fuels a public perception which is flawed around Lucy and her character and nature. And I think it was completely unforgivable for the prosecution to use that sort of evidence in court. The comments being made by the barrister around, you only seem to cry when your boyfriend turns up in court, and these sorts of things. You don't seem to be crying when we're talking about babies being harmed. How do you expect somebody to behave, when they've been arrested for the most horrendous, the most serious of crimes? How would you behave, Chris? How would I behave? I have no idea how I would behave if somebody came in now and arrested me for murder. I've got a pretty good idea. I'd probably be quite vociferous. I'd probably be banging the table. But that doesn't indicate that I'm either guilty or not guilty. The comments, by people like, Judith Moritz about sitting next to her in court, for days on end and seeing her demeanour and, the sort of, the way in which she was acting, indicative of, how she felt, indicative of guilt. It's just, it's just absolute nonsense. And I'm really, really concerned that it was given any credence whatsoever, and that it was put before the jury as part of the pile of circumstantial evidence that unfortunately convicted them.
Yeah. So you're aware, I know that Paul Hughes actually questioned why Lucy wasn't banging on the table in the police station proclaiming her innocence. Again, this is in conversation with Liz Hall. I found that to be one of the most astonishing things I've ever heard in my life, I think, because, it's bad enough for a member of the public to think that, but obviously he's leading the investigation. He's supposed to be doing a PR job. That's why he's appearing on the podcast. So I just couldn't believe it. What do you make of that statement?
Well, it was astonishingly naive because what he's saying is complete nonsense. Whether she banged on the table or not has no relationship to anything evidential. What would he have said? What inference would have been drawn if she had banged on the table? So if she doesn't bang on the table, does that make her guilty? Does that make her appear guilty? If she does bang on the table, that's just the sort of thing that somebody who's guilty would do, isn't it? To try and deflect attention. I think it's naive, and I think it's unprofessional for him to say that. It's not something that's within his knowledge. He has no professional competence to make to draw any inference whatsoever from somebody's behaviour, and I think it was completely inappropriate for him to say that.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm going to ask you one more final question today because I've got still quite a few questions to go, and we'll probably go on for quite a long time. So I'll hold those back for another time, and I'll maybe ask for viewers to send in some questions as well. The last question I'm going to ask you today, I think I pretty much know the answer to this question, but it just simply, did this investigation fail basic policing standards? And if so, could you tell us why?
Well, I think, as I said quite early in our conversation, the way that it was structured and the way that it was resourced was pretty good. They had the right number of people there. They had all the roles filled. It was, as far as I can see from the public domain, a very effective investigation. I think where it has failed is in going down a path that it appears was led by confirmation bias. As we've discussed, at a very early stage, a decision was taken that the consultants, the narrative they constructed was right, that the babies had been killed and unlawfully injured, and that Lucy Letby was responsible. From the point at which they appointed Daly Evans, again, his confidence led them to believe that the babies had been killed and unlawfully injured, and that increased, I think, the confirmation bias that drove the investigation. So I can't know that for 100% because we haven't seen the documentation. And I think it's important as part of the overall review of the investigation of the circumstances that material is produced and is reviewed by a competent individual, so we can understand how the investigation actually was conducted. All I can say from looking on the outside is that I'm surprised that the investigation was conducted in the way that it was, and the proper safeguards were not put in place around managing the potential for confirmation bias. Albeit, right at the start of the Operation Hummingbird video, Paul Hughes is very clear in saying we had to investigate everybody and all other scenarios. I'm not sure that happened, and I think we need to resolve that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And thank you more broadly for speaking out on Lucy's case and getting involved in what obviously something is very important to me, but very, very important to everyone that's watching this video as well. And we'll have you back in the new year if you're available at that time. We have quite a few questions, and I like to get questions from viewers. I know there's going to be a lot, so we can easily do another interview of this length, at least I would say. So we'll have you back then, and thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, not at all. This is really important stuff, Chris. It's not just about Lucy. That's important enough. It's disgraceful that she's locked up for life terms on the basis of this evidence. But I think there are massive questions for public confidence in police investigations, particularly in this very complex area, for the whole issue around how experts are acquired and managed, and for the way in which these sorts of matters are heard by the criminal courts. So I think there's some really big questions around that I think this case is going to be the catalyst for. So thanks very much for inviting me along.
Yeah, that's no problem. Just to pick up on what you said there, even though it was supposed to be the end. But yeah, I think that is an issue, the investigation of cases that hasn't been talked about enough. I think this has to be something that comes out of this, is that we need to look at the way the police are investigating cases, why this case has been investigated in this way. And I don't know what that would look like exactly, but I don't think we can just say, oh, this is one terrible mistake and never mind, and let's just assume that the police will investigate future cases adequately. I do think there needs to be a kind of root and branch investigation into why they got it so wrong,
I hesitate to extend it even more, Chris. I think it's an important point that arises from that, is that what will be happening now, I'm absolutely sure, is that the SIO and other key members of the team will be lecturing around the UK and perhaps internationally about how to conduct healthcare related investigations, because they'll be seeing this as a success. And a concern I have is that this isn't seen as a model going forward for how police investigate healthcare related deaths.
Yeah. So we'll leave it there on that chilling note. Hopefully it can be resolved. Yeah, but thanks again for your time. We really appreciate it, and I'll look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed, Chris.
No problem.